Paul Catalina, you sent this out. We have not gotten away from this, but the SEC and Big Ten, and we know the story. We've discussed it a ton. Last week, of course, there was the SEC spring meetings in Destin. The Big 12 then had theirs in Orlando, and it just seemed like that turf war, which is still there. But John Tolte, who we've had on this show many, many times, did a little background story on not that there's any kind of, what is going on between the Big Ten and the SEC, but I don't think the Big Ten expected this thing to change. I don't think the SEC expected that this thing would go from 5 plus 11 or what they wanted with multiple qualifiers from various conferences to end up right now. The momentum is 5 plus 11.
Yeah, I think, and if you see this, like the reason they're scared about the committee, the quote here, you can read the whole thing. They said, we want you to pick the best teams, but then no one told them how to find the best teams. So, and this has been true. This is Mike Trengizi, who used to be a conference commissioner in the Big East, said this, and it is right because they've always had a moving target as to what the metrics are and what the difference is. And then when they were picking 4, it was really, really hard because that's when we got stuff like game control or travel time or, whatever it is. And so they've come up with all these things. And I understand the SEC and anybody wanting to have like a definite set of like what the best metrics are. That's fine. It's just weird coming from the SEC, who got 3 teams in and not 4 last year, and that's why they're mad. But part of the reason the SEC, I think, wasn't ready for the automatic qualifier thing to kind of become unpopular in their conferences, I think they thought the coaches would go for it. And the coaches were all like, no, we want 5 plus 11 because that gives us the best opportunity. I think that caught some of them by surprise, especially based on this article. When they brought the coaches in the room, the tide shifted.
Well, you'd think they would have known that prior to when
I think that Greg Sankey maybe knew that, and Greg Sankey's always felt that way. I think that several of the ADs did. I don't think the presidents know what their coaches are thinking quite as much as they probably should across
they have
a lot of
much
these.
Bigger fish to fry in many ways.
Look, there are schools, Linda Livingstone's on every committee in the world. She understands sports. She was an athlete. But for every one of her, there's 10 people, like the president at Cal that's like, so what are we getting? What's going on here? What's it? They just don't deal with it. That's what the athletic director does, and they just give a report every month. So, I think that's where a little bit of the shock was. And then the coaches don't want to go to 9 conference games. They don't like the idea of the play-in tournament game at all. All of those things, they want to stay kind of where it is and just pick the 16 best. And the Big Ten, I think, thought that the SEC was more in lockstep with them, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
In this article from Talty, the Big Ten and SEC may not be as aligned as they once were when it comes to future college football playoff formatting. Also, Sankey and other conference commissioners expected to have a call, in fact, today, to further discuss the latest discussions, the college football playoff discussions. They'll meet in person on June 18th in Asheville, North Carolina. So it is, I think it's going to end up 5-11. What do you think? You think it's going to end up 5-11? Do you think that the Big Ten, are they going to flex their muscles and say, nope, it needs to be like this?
I have no idea what the Big Ten is going to do, but I think that anybody figuring that the SEC and Big Ten were just going to hold hands and just jog along each other and skip and have fun and whistle and they were all going to agree on everything were just fooling themselves. I mean,
legacy is something that is earned over time. From taking on your day-to-day to reaching new peaks. With a signature style, build the life you want to lead. Mountain Khakis' sole pursuit is to create superior apparel designed to stand up to the elements and the test of time.
They're this predatorial in some ways to be the absolute best. You think they're not going to be that way against each other? Because that's ultimately what it boils down to. Now, I'm sure they have some greater agreement unofficially, and this big picture outlook on the future of college football, where they are the AFC, NFC, or whatever the grand vision really is. But yeah, we've heard a whole lot from the SEC. We've heard a whole lot of nothing from the Big Ten. I don't think that's coincidental. I think that's by design to some extent. And I think, it's been a matter of letting Greg Sankey go ahead and put his neck out there and take the arrows and do all that, say the things that people don't want to have to say because it's going to get the negative backlash that a lot of it got last week. But I also think that they don't necessarily agree on everything. So I have no idea. If I'm the Big Ten, I'd go the AQ route, because I think you've got more teams to be able to do that now, for one, with the PAC expansion, but also because I don't think you're necessarily as guaranteed as the SEC is to have all of those teams up in the rankings. Last year you did. Last year you had it great. You had Penn State, you had Indiana, you had all these schools. So maybe every year it'll be like that. But if I had to bet, I'd bet on the SEC having more of a haul in that top 16 year to year than the Big Ten. And maybe I'm not adjusting quickly enough to where it is about to even out more because of the money and things like that, and the last two national champions. And maybe the Big Ten's about to go on a crazy run where they're taking more of the spots. But I do think that they probably like the 4 AQs, because why wouldn't you? You get 4 teams automatically in the playoff and then maybe get some others on top of that. So I don't know how you wouldn't like that. But I think if you're the SEC or the Big Ten, you're both okay with pretty much anything, because you're going to get a handful of teams every year, no matter what the design is. So how greedy do you want to be, or how confident are you in which model gets you the most teams year to year? I think the difference is probably pretty negligible ultimately. But yeah, I won't pretend to know what the Big Ten's thinking, other than I don't think it's exactly what the SEC's thinking all the time.
All right, let me ask you this. There's a lot of this in this article from John Talty, and you hear about the metrics or the criteria or whatever. Do they even know how to put the committee together? Is that one of the issues as well? It seems like there's kind of a cross-section of different people. This is in the chat room with Old Barncat. Committees should be made up of retired college coaches from all divisions. That's a note. But is that the right way? Is there still going to be a bias there? Is there still going to be a regional or a conference or whatever historical bias? But it does seem like, do they know what they're doing in putting together the committee first? Has anyone ever had a problem with that? Or is it what the committee needs to decide? Which one comes first?
Well, I don't if you look at the way the committee's set up, if you look at everybody just based on their credentials, I don't think I've ever had a problem with anybody that's been on the committee credential-wise. The problem with it is we don't know how much influence certain power brokers have over it. I mean, look, when Bill Hancock was in charge, when you heard, you guys, he told it to your face. We're fine with college football going the way of just these teams. So you kind of knew where he stood as the spokesman for the whole organization and the head of the college football playoff, group. So when you hear something like that, well, you got to wonder, okay, well, who's telling, he serves at the pleasure of whom? Not clearly, it's supposed to be everybody, but clearly he's got some people in the room that are pushing some agendas that he also feels are aligned with the best for college football. So when you hear someone like Bill Hancock for years say the things that he did, you're like, well, he really only cares what, Mike Slive or Greg Sankey or Jim Delaney or Kevin Warren or those conferences thought, because when it came down to it, he was advocating for just kind of all the brands. Now, I don't think that's the case with Richard Clark, at least right now, at all. And we've talked to him a bunch. He seems to be taking kind of a holistic view of the process. But I think that's the issue. It's not, the credentials of people on the committee, is who's influencing the outside of that. So when they go in those rooms and the person in charge, whether it's Bill Hancock or Richard Clark, lays things out, who has the political sway over them. And look, Greg Sankey's even mentioned when they go in the rooms, they make political deals. That's all part of this. So when you have somebody who slants so hard towards elitism like Bill Hancock did for years and years and years, then yeah, you're going to have these results in the committee, because that's the general message they're given the whole time.
Well, first of all, I don't think active athletic directors should be on a playoff committee.
I agree
think
with you.
having active people is just asking for trouble. I don't understand why that's allowed. I like Mack Rhodes over at Baylor, but I don't think he should be having a say on the college football playoff committee and determining teams. And I know they're all saying, well, we're being non-biased and holding each other accountable and this and that. There's enough former coaches, there's enough former personalities that you can put together a committee. You do not have to have active members of institutions that are currently involved. So that's number one. I think that's entirely unnecessary. And I mean, did you read the article in full? Because I don't know about a committee and their feelings on the committee. I know the SEC has griped about it quite a bit, and it seems like they're already planting the seeds to try and massage the committee to their favor, every single other thing. But the first sentence in the story is not about the committee, but just in general, to answer your question. The SEC isn't waffling on its stance on the future college football playoff format. It just doesn't know what it wants. So they don't know what they want. That's the very first sentence. They don't know what they want. So if they don't even know what they want, then I sure as hell don't know what they want. And I think what they want is as much as they can possibly get. And it's a matter of how you get there. But, I think everybody's still figuring out, even with their pamphlets and their, notes and everything that's been passed along over the last week, you're building up a certain angle. But is this better than this? I don't think you can really tell because it's all so brand new and we've never done it before.
Well, I did read the article, but I'm glad you brought that up at the beginning. But Bracket Cat says humans are terrible at this. Let the unbiased computers. Who feeds the computers?
Well,
where do the rankings come from? Who's the ones voting in the various polls that also lead to what are part of the, I guess, the data that you put inside the computers?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than just plugging in poll rankings by humans. That's a part of it, but it's an 18th of the overall formula or a 12th of the overall formula. So there's always going to be a human factor, but there's a lot of things that are just measurements. That has to be determined by humans as well. Like at some point, a human has to do something. We can't just say, here, computer, take care of everything and set our playoff up for us. And put all the numbers in that you want, and you spit out the teams that you want in the order that you want, and then we're just going to take it and apply it. Like that's not how it works. There has to be humans involved somewhere. But for the most part, humans are just inputting data, and then the computer chews it up, spits it out, whatever formula you've come up with, and gives you the information on the other side of it in as unbiased a way as possible, like the BCS did. Now, people clearly had their issue with that, but in light of the human element and people just making up stuff as they've gone along, I think there is a desire for just as unbiased and straightforward of a thing as possible, tool as possible, and that is a computer, as opposed to a group of active ADs and legends and military people and whoever's just politically, in favor at that moment or knows the right people or whatever. I think most people now, because they've seen so much of what they consider bias, would like to have the least biased thing possible, which is a computer, which is weird knowing where we came from with the BCS, but we were also determining 2 teams. We weren't determining 12, 16. It's a whole different ball game. So it's all new.
I also think that, look, what do the other committees do? What does baseball do? What does basketball do? They have a Ken Palm. They have RPI. They've had all these things, metrics that help them. Football does not have a comparable thing that they use for sure. So there are things. So basketball, when you listen to basketball coaches talk about why they schedule, they say, well, this is good in Ken Palm. And then, when after the game, after those games happen, and they said, look, we have this win against the top, the top quadrant in Ken Palm and all these things. And those are metrics that can back them up. But ultimately, humans do make decisions on the finer points of it in the NCAA tournament. I think a combination of those things is good. Like, I don't think you can just leave it up to one thing or the other. I think the hardest thing with college football compared to any other sport, especially compared to basketball, is you are going to have to get a rating system that just is about that year. And what the Big Ten and SEC, especially the SEC, is pushing is that a year ago matters. And it doesn't. It only matters in the year. And that's the thing. That's, I think, the metric they would like to get in, if there is one. It's like, hey, we're always good. Yeah, but it doesn't matter. Like, this is only about this year.
Okay, who floods the polls with the votes? Who's the one that sets up the coaches poll or the media poll? The AP
media
poll?
And the coaches.
Right. All right. But if you have ranked wins, how many of them are going to be ranked wins based on a preseason poll that is based on, I guess you could say, tradition or perception?
I don't know, because that's what you would determine is how you do all that. Like I don't know. We have no idea how that would
The
work.
preseason polls, I don't have a problem with them as far as discussion to set up the TV networks, the games they can promote 1 and 2 or 4 and 8 or whatever it is. But in the end, if you have 12 or 13 teams or 11 or 12 teams ranked inside the top 25 at the beginning, and you're eventually going to create, which we discussed earlier this week, is this bubble.
But it's
teams.
not all based on just top 25 wins. That's why there's other categories and other things that are part of the formula. It's not just
It's a part of
ranked,
it, though.
Yeah, it's a part of it, but how much? Is it half of it? Well, that's substantial. Or is it 1/20th of something? Because then it really doesn't matter nearly as much. So you're asking a question that nobody has the answer to, because we're not even settled on the format, much less how they're going to decide the format. So I know you're setting it up as like, here's where the bias comes in, but yeah, that's true at the polls to some extent, but I'm not going to get scared of a boogeyman that doesn't even exist yet,
But
right?
I think also, though, to pull out like part of the problem with the polls, when you mentioned preseason polls, that's part of the problem, is that the polls until a certain point shouldn't matter. Like until they've played a couple of games and we're kind of through it.
Like they do about what? Early October, they start to have the college football playoff standings.
Yeah. Okay, but we know that is not going to change. They're not going to have preseason polls.
The networks are not going to let you, by the way, eliminate polls because they use those to promote their games.
But my point being is there's a lot of, well, heck, Kansas State was number one, when they beat them. Yeah, but if they were number one when you beat them in September and they have 7 losses when you're having this discussion, that number one was never really number one.
Well, then I think that's guys where
you have to take those kind of things out.
Yeah, that's where you have a committee and you talk about, well, what are their ranked wins? And you say, well, this is one of their ranked wins. Well, that was in week 1 against a team that's now 500. Okay, well, then that one doesn't count as much as this one. Like I understand the concerns. I just think we're getting too far ahead of ourselves with worrying about minute details that aren't going to be so minute in the future, but right now really don't matter as much as they will when the time comes, because they've got to settle on a format. They've got to settle on how the format's determined, and then we can get into, okay, what goes into that. But like getting hung up on the preseason poll mattering too much in a system that is completely a blank sheet right now is really not that big of a deal. But like when you come down to determining teams, then how is that looked at and what is put into place to try to counteract that and not have too much of a weight on the fact that somebody was number 15 and Alabama beat them, and that's an extra top 25 win versus Iowa State, who had that's so far into the weeds that I think that's not really the concern at this very moment, but that will be a concern, of course, when you finally settle on how you're going to determine these things, and that will need to be taken into account.